Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wallace Collection online, and welcome to our Meet the Expert talk for July. This month, we'll be looking at a master armourer of Augsburg, Anton Peffenhauser. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by both Dr. Tobias Capwell of the Wallace Collection and Dr. Holger Schuckelt of the Staatlichen Kunstsammlungen. Apologies for any pronunciation there. We're delighted to be joined by two great speakers today, and we will be making a start in a few minutes' time. As always, there's a little bit of housekeeping, and we're going to start with something slightly different today. Unfortunately, Holger's camera has had a little bit of difficulty. Today we're having a few technical difficulties, so we do apologize for a lack of video feed there, but we hope you enjoy the talk all the same. I'm sure the content will be fantastic and engaging as always. A little bit of housekeeping for everybody at home. First of all, just to say, if you're having any technical difficulties yourself, do just let us know. You can contact us either via the chat or Q&A functions on Zoom and via the content and comments section on YouTube, rather. So if you're having any difficulties, do just let us know and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. You can, of course, also use the chat and comments section to send in any questions for today's speakers, and we'll have a bit of time at the end of today's talk to run through those. So do make sure to get in any questions or comments you may have, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. If you miss any of today's talk, don't worry at all. We will be recording this talk, and it will be available on our YouTube channel immediately afterwards. And finally, just to say that we have live captions today. We have our live captioner joining us. So if you do require any additional captions, you should receive those as standard on YouTube, and on Zoom, you can select that via the caption button at the bottom of your screen. So with all that boring business out the way, please allow me to hand over to Toby and Holger for today's talk. Over to you.
Thank you, Ollie. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome, Holger from Dresden.
Hello.
Hello. The Meet the Expert series is really a chance for one of the curators at the Wallace Collection to kind of take over the public program a little bit, with the idea being that each month we can focus on something that's of special interest to us, an area of the collection that we'd like to focus on, something quite specific where there might be new research going on that we'd like to talk about. And that's really why this month I want to focus on the Renaissance armourer Anton Peffenhauser. Not only is his work well represented in the Wallace Collection, there has also been, for the last 10 or 15 years, quite a lot of interesting research going on and new discoveries being made about him, primarily by Holger in Dresden. So rather than just delivering the usual online lecture for such an event, I thought it would be more interesting and certainly more enlightening for me, and I hope for everybody else, to run this more as a conversation with Holger. He's the one who's really been working on this. And actually a few years ago, he came to the Wallace to study our pieces and made various discoveries. So I thought we could go over that today, and also, of course, talk a lot more about Holger's collection in Dresden. So Holger, let's start there. Could you first just, for those members of the audience who don't know, can you tell us something about the state art museums in Dresden, a little history and a little bit about the collection before we get more specific?
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to this talk. The Dresden State Art Collections consists of 15 different museums of whose collections range from antiquity to present day. And the Dresden Armory is the oldest still existing collection in Dresden. And its roots go back to the late 15th century, when the city became the residence of the dukes and later the electors of Saxony. And in this collection, the electors of Saxony kept their personal weapons and armor, but also diplomatic gifts from other rulers and princes from more or less all over Europe and the Orient. So we have big collections of Oriental pieces. We have a collection of really very nice suits of armor. We have a huge collection of European firearms and edged weapons. So altogether, the Dresden Armory has around 15,000 groups of objects or single objects.
And another interesting point, I think, that is of great relevance to the history of many other collections of arms and armor around the world is that over a number of centuries, since the 17th century, really, pieces, because of its enormous size and scope, pieces have periodically been given away as gifts by the electors of Saxony or sold or otherwise escaped Dresden. And there are many other museums around the world who now can trace the provenance of parts of their collections back to Dresden as well. So it has an extraordinary kind of family relationship with other museums all over the world.
Yeah, that's really true. I mean, we not only got presents from other rulers, we also gave pieces away. But especially in the 19th century, we sold a lot of our objects to finance movings of the museum from one building to another. But actually, it's really, yeah, it's not so nice that pieces are not in Dresden anymore. But as you said, it's a nice thing if you go wherever more or less in the world, you will see objects originally came from Dresden. And so it's always like, visiting part of the family. It's really,
yes,
yeah.
indeed.
Great.
Yes, and I suppose we could probably talk for a while just on Dresden escapees who have ended up in the Wallace Collection, because that's a larger subject. Today we're focusing on the work of one master armorer in the 16th century, Anton Peffenhauser. Interestingly, that is not for us an area where the Wallace is related directly to Dresden. Some of our Peffenhauser pieces may have come from Dresden, perhaps, but we can't be sure. We know really very little about their history. Many of the pieces in the Wallace collection are probably acquired in the Paris art market in the 19th century, but we can't be sure of many things. But just the fact that we're dealing with two substantial groups of the master is a relationship enough for us today, I think. So we're actually, I wanted to start with this image. It's very, very unusual to have a portrait of a Renaissance armorer in any media, painted, sculpted, coins, medals, whatever. There are a few, but not very many. And to have this wonderful little etched steel portrait, partially gilded, of Anton Peffenhauser is really remarkable. And it's a great place to start in our knowledge of recognizing his pieces, because if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see his coat of arms, which is a 3 conjoined legs in armor. Normally referred to in heraldry as a triskelius. In the UK, it's most famous perhaps as the device of the Isle of Man. But it's also, as well as being Anton Peffenhauser's coat of arms, it's also the mark that he used on the products of his workshop, perhaps those that he himself worked on. And it's a very tiny little mark. It's only about 4 or 5 millimeters in diameter. And you know, the triskelius is there if you know to look for it, but perhaps slightly hard to recognize otherwise. Holger has been really driving forward the research on Anton Peffenhauser for the last, 15 years or so, I think. Holger, when did you begin your Peffenhauser project exactly?
It was more or less in 2010.
All right, yeah.
I started in Dresden in 1988, but first I was more busy with our Oriental collection. And then when we opened the Turkish chamber in 2010, I started to look more into details of our collection of suits of armor. And quite soon I recognized that we originally had the biggest collection of Peffenhauser armor worldwide. And so, yeah, that was a point when I started to search what we still have, where pieces have gone, and what is in other collections. And so at the moment now, it's a huge number of pieces which should have been made by him, but that's a topic we can talk about it later, perhaps.
Yes.
But you mentioned this mark. That's really interesting that you should think you have these nice portrait of him with his coat of arms, and we know that his mark was the same as on his coat of arms, but there are only very few suits of armor where you really can find it. That's really tricky.
Yeah, so from the early part of his story, before we get into the surviving works by Peffenhauser, what have you been able to find out about his life history, and maybe perhaps just a couple of preliminary thoughts on why he is an important person in the story of armor?
Actually, it was interesting to find quite a lot of information about his life, much more than about other armorers. What we know is that he arrived on our Earth in around 1525. It's not 100% sure, but approximately this time. And that from 1545 onwards, he was already a master in Augsburg. Originally, he came probably from Munich, but then in 1545, he was in Augsburg as a master armorer.
So he's already a master when he's 20 years old.
Yeah. So in the list of the taxes, he has been already called a master. So yeah, it's very early, actually, really. Perhaps his day of birth was a little bit earlier. As I said, we are not 100% sure, but 1525 is always a date or the year which is has been said in publications. But in 1545 he was not really very important yet. He didn't pay a lot of taxes. He didn't worked a lot for different clients, but that changed in the 50s of the 16th century. So he worked a lot for Spanish nobility in the 50s of the 16th century, people who were connected with the Emperor Charles V. And so that was, you show these pictures now. They have a book with sketches from Jörg Sorg. He was an etcher in Augsburg, and he made this book with drawings of suits of armor he decorated for different armors. And there are also some works he made for Peffenhouser in the years between 1550 and 1558 or something like that.
And the Sorg album is really the first direct evidence that we have of his work. I mean, we have mentions of him in city records earlier, but now we have visual evidence combined with the text that tells us what he was making and precisely when.
That's right. We have the early names of his customers. We have the dates of some of the armors. Suits of armor, and actually to some of these sketches we also have original pieces which are in different collections in Europe and North America. So we have pieces, for example, this arm was in the Higgins Museum in Worcester in the United States, and this armor was made for the
first one is
the Toledo,
Don Alba, Boantassa,
you have pieces also in the Wallace Collection in the Tower of London. So there are single pieces of these armor in quite a few collections worldwide, but not the whole armor survived. But still, it's a very lucky thing that we have this information. We have these drawings. We have some of the original pieces from the early works of Peffenhauser.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that his earliest works are in steel are only represented by the random fragments that can be attributed due to the presence of the Zorg album. I'm struck by the fact that at the Wallace we have the reinforcing bever or buff for the jousting armor illustrated here. And I mean, here is a piece of Peffenhauser's early work that we can precisely date and attribute to a particular patron. And already quite early in his career, maybe when he's 30 or so years old, he's got this incredible sense of sculptural form, as well as working with the greatest etchers in his city. So it seems like once he got going and once he became known, his prestige seems to have increased quite rapidly.
That's true. I mean, one thing really was, we don't know, of course, why, but he was connected with the most important people in the empire. So people who really were in the surrounding of the emperor. And I mean, we have these very important early works of his craftsmanship, but we also know that, for example, in the 50s, he already opened a second and later a third workshop. So he really produced quite a lot already. And yeah, that's one of the...
Was he opening additional workshops then because there were regulations that limited the size of a single workshop? I mean, why would he need more than one?
Actually, that's one. It's a good question. We don't know really for 100 for sure. But as far as I know, you had really regulations that you were not allowed to have, for example, many chimneys for one building. And so to make it bigger, to produce more, he needed different places to work. But it also already gives a very interesting view on his practice. I mean, of course, he can't have done all the work by himself. If he had several workshops, he couldn't be in every single workshop every minute. So that's also a very interesting point. We'll come back later to that. But yeah, so in his very early years, he already started to produce a lot, and not only these richly decorated armor we have got in Dresden now, and we have seen already some examples, but also we produced a lot of very plain things. But he also was not only an armorer, he was also a businessman, and especially in his later years, he was probably more important as a businessman as an armorer. So, and yeah, Augsburg. I mean, you have seen, you show us this nice picture of Augsburg here. It was next to Nuremberg, in the German areas, the most important place to produce armor. And Peffenhauser was in the late period of this craftsmanship. He was the most important armorer in Augsburg, and he became more and more famous.
And that's, I mean, for me, I've always thought that to be quite extraordinary, because he, early in his career, he seems to have lived through the greatest commercial crisis that the Augsburg armorers had ever faced. As we've already seen, early in his career, Peffenhauser was working for the Spanish royal court, as were most of the other major armorers in Augsburg, for the simple reason that the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, was also King of Spain. And the emperor's personal taste was for the patronage of Augsburg armorers. Of course, he's very famous for having a close relationship with the Helmschmied family, perhaps the most famous of all Augsburg armorers. And of course, where a king or a monarch goes, so do everyone else follow. He sets the fashion. He is the maker of manners, as Shakespeare said. So in the early 1550s, Augsburg was heavily committed to major contracts to Spanish noblemen. But then when Philip, his Charles V's son, Prince Philip of Spain, became the ruler of Spain in his own right, he was very anxious to cast himself in his own way, to define his own identity. And one of the ways he did that was to remove his Augsburg patronage and develop a new style and new self-image with armours in the city of Landshut, specifically Wolfgang Großschädel of the city of Landshut. And isn't it right that the loss of all of these contracts and the dedication to the Spanish court for so long kind of caused many armourers in Augsburg to go out of business? And Peffenhouser seems to have been one of the only ones who survived and indeed thrived and was able to diversify and attract other clients.
Yeah, that's true. I found a lot of material in the archive in Augsburg, which is just telling this story. I mean, Peffenhouser was so, already so famous, so clever, that after the death of Charles V and that the center of the empire moved to Prague and Vienna, he worked especially in the 1560s, he worked a lot for different emperors and their sons and so on in Vienna and Prague. And and what I found is a lot of material, letters from different people complaining that Peffenhauser got all the contracts for armor, so much that he couldn't really do all the jobs. And then he was collecting the contracts, and then he went to different people and asked them to do at least part of the contract. And so already in these days, he was a businessman, not only putting Augsburg armourer into work, but also armourer in Nuremberg. So I found letters that he moved to Nuremberg to buy armor there, bring them back to Augsburg, and then selling them in form of a big contract to people. For example, I found that he had a contract to produce 2,000 simple field armor in a period of 3 months, which was even with 3 workshops, it was simply not possible. And so he got the whole contract, but then he asked several armorers from Augsburg and Nuremberg to work at parts of this contract. And so we have a lot of letters complaining that he, of course, gets most of the money, that he was not allowed to bring armor from Nuremberg to Augsburg, which was a problem with the guilds, the rules of the guilds in these cities. And so there's a lot of material you can really find in the archive in Augsburg, telling you little detailed stories about what was going on in Augsburg in these days. And many of the armor had struggled to survive, but not Peffenhauser. He was famous, he was rich.
And I mean, it's a joy to me that we have such a wealth of documentation that can add so much background and color to our understanding of this person. Because in the study of arms and armor, we normally just have the objects, and we often know nothing whatever about the people who made them. If we're lucky enough to have a mark, and the mark is lucky enough to be identified, maybe we can put a name. And maybe there's some real sketchy information, but usually you have to get used to disappointment as an arms and armor curator, and get used to the idea that there's so much that you will never know. And Peffenhauser is starting to reveal himself as the great exception to this. And I think then, so once you have this incredible wealth of documentation, we can then try to look at it together with the surviving objects. And amazingly, there's quite a lot of surviving Peffenhauser armor around. And of course, concentrated most closely in Dresden. Shall we look briefly at the major Peffenhauser pieces in Dresden and use that as a way to expand on all of this?
Okay.
All right. So this is the earliest piece, I think.
Yeah. So after he had contracts with Vienna and Prague, and he did work quite a lot for the Bavarian dynasty of the Wittelsbach, he had first contacts to the Electors of Saxony in the 1576. But as far as we know, they didn't came together really. But in 1583, Elector August of Saxony ordered a garniture of suits of armor for the field and for the joust and for the foot tournament. And I mean, what you said is that we are in the lucky position with Peffenhauser that we have so many documents, but still often enough we have the unlucky moment that we simply can't bring these documents with armor together. So the earliest surviving armor is this so-called Waffle Armor in our collection, because of the decoration of these little squares. And one armor and a saddle and a chamfron are in Dresden, and other pieces are in New York in the Met. Yes, on the right side. But the interesting thing is really, I mean, we always say that it is the earliest order from 1582, but still I'm not for 100% sure, because we have a lot, several letters going forward and backward from the Elector of Saxony to Augsburg, and from Peffenhauser from Augsburg back to Dresden. But it's not 100% sure whether it really means this armor. But still, I think it is this armor, because it's also very interesting that, and that is also something typical for Peffenhauser, he reused older fragments from other armor to create new works. And so at this armor, we also can find on several places on the armor, we can find elements which show us that he reused parts from an older armor, and also the shape, for example, of the breast is a bit old-fashioned for the years in the 1580s.
Yeah, and you have similar waffle iron decoration on other Augsburg armors that survive too, or that is comparable, but those tend to be more like in the 1560s.
Yeah, exactly. So we have this kind of decoration on earlier pieces. The shape of the breast is earlier. So he definitely reused earlier pieces for this contract of 1582, if this is really the armor, which means, is meant in all these letters from Peffenhauser and from the Elector of Saxony. Yeah, that was the earliest thing. But then after the death of Elector August, with his son, Christian I, it really became a complete new story. Christian was so happy with his armor. I mean, August ordered it for Christian, that Christian only ruled for 5 years, then he died. And in these 5 years, he ordered quite a lot of suits of armor in Augsburg at the workshop of Pathenhauser. So altogether, I could find in our inventory books 39 suits of armor, either made by Peffenhauser or bought by the Electors of Saxony from Peffenhauser or attributed to Peffenhauser. So it's really 39, but of course not all are still in Dresden. But most of these armor have been made for Christian. So what you see here is on the left-hand side is a painting showing Christian in a Peffenhauser armor. And on the right-hand side is a picture of an armor made for Christian with the coat of arms of Christian on the horse armor, with the same decoration as on the armor on the painting. But the interesting thing is that I found out now that it was not as one armor as you could believe if you go in our exhibition. It was a collection of at least 6 very similar suits of armor, but perhaps even more, where the decoration on the first look, it's very identical, but if you look a bit closer, you can see differences. And also the mass of pieces shows us it must have been that he ordered at least 6 very similar suits of armor. Mm-hmm. And what we have got now in Dresden is a combined armor made of pieces from different of these armor, because the other pieces are either not existing more or are all over the world now. You have pieces in the Wallace Collection, there are pieces in New York, there are pieces in Nuremberg, pieces in Chicago, Detroit, in London, in everywhere, Paris. You can find pieces of this armor or of this group of armor everywhere. And here on this picture you show us now, you have the helmet and the bump plate and pauldron, also with the same decoration, where just minor details are different. And that's a tricky thing. What we have got in Dresden now is we have fragments of 6 different armor, but nothing really fits together. So we have, for example, what you see on the left picture, which is from our exhibition. You see this grand guard for the left shoulder, but on the chest or the breast we have still got, you have no opportunity to fix it. So there must have been a breast from a different armor where this piece belonged to, and things like that. We have 4 saddles for these in this same decoration, which is of course too much for one armor.
And I'm especially struck by, when looking at the helmet in the Wallace collection, this is a very rich thing. It's beautifully etched and gilded. We have good amounts of surviving gilding on it, especially in areas which were protected. But it has a lot of combat damage on it. It has some very, very deep sword cuts and weapon strokes really all over it. And I think it's a really important thing to stress that these, even though they are so rich and so expensive, the electors loved tournament fighting and formal combats of all kinds. And even with equipment as rich as this, they expected to fight in it and use it up and even destroy it. And I wonder, whether Christian, trying to sense something of his character, some of these might have been intended for other members of a team, perhaps, that he's not ordering just for himself, but if he wants his whole tournament team to look as they should, then he buys armor to equip them as well, perhaps.
Definitely. I mean, we know that if there have been tournaments at the Dresden court, not every single nobleman had his own suit of armor. And so the Dresden Armory spent a lot of these armor to give them to other people taking part at the tournaments in Dresden. And not only in the times of Elector August and Christian I, they both were very keen in tournaments. But just a few days ago, I held a talk in Munich about the tournaments in 1709 and 1719 in Dresden, where all these armor have been used again. And so we have prints and drawings from 1709, 1719, where you can see that even these Peffenhouser armor have been used for the tournaments in the early 18th century still.
Amazing, amazing. And you have other evidence of later use and reuse on other Peffenhouser armors in the collection, like yet another full Peffenhouser horse armor.
Yeah, for example, this horse armor, it was also polished, and on these globes on the breast of the horse armor, underneath the painting, there's still, you can see it, still the coat of arms of Christian I. But then in 1719, for the tournament to the wedding of the son of August the Strong, and the big tournament in September 1719, it has been painted over with this black color and golden decoration, because you had 4 groups of participants at the tournament, and 2 groups have been dressed in polished suits of armor, and 2 groups in black armor with decoration. And so we painted this polished armor with this black color and some golden decoration to fit it for this one black group at the tournament in 1719.
And we've talked something about the typology of the plates and the different forms of the armor, but you know, tracing Peffenhauser's story through the decoration of these armors is quite an important approach too, but not entirely without difficulty, because of course an armorer like Peffenhauser can be shown to have been working with different decorators at different times who may also have worked for other people. But it's certainly in the decoration of some of the Peffenhauser pieces in Dresden where we see other connections between Dresden and the Wallace Collection.
Decoration is always interesting and also always important to see which pieces belong to which armor and what is really creating one set. But of course, the decoration is not, as you already mentioned, not a good way to see what is in Peffenhauser armor and what not, because, as you said, people like Georg Sorg worked for different armors, but also Peffenhauser may have different people to decorate his armor. And so, of course, that's always a bit tricky. Also important is the shape of some pieces like helmets and things. And it's really interesting if you see these richly decorated pieces, but also the very plain ones. The shape of the helmets is always very similar. But if you see helmets from other people, other armor, it looks different. But I mean, you will show us another picture in a moment. I mean, this is an armor bought or purchased in 1588 by Christian I in the workshop of Peffenhauser. And what you did see here now was the same armor here in the Italian form for the tilting. And if you can go back, please. That's for the German version with this targe on the left shoulder. The Italian form has this grand guard, what you can see here. But the interesting thing is, if you can show us the next picture now, please, that in 1588, Christian bought 3 different armor, 2 very similar decorated in with the same size, probably made for himself, and this one with a different decoration, and also the armor is much smaller as the other 2 armors. So what I really believe that it was not made for him, but he didn't had a son, so probably he just bought it because he liked it, or perhaps it was for a person at the Dresden court where we don't know really for whom it was. But if you see the decoration here, which of course has not been made by Peffenhauser, but one for by a person working for him, and then you see pieces with the same decoration. Perhaps you can see the next picture, like these pauldrons in the Wallace collection, where you really can see, okay, the gilding on our armor is only there in fragments, and in the Wallace collection the gilding is still fine. But then if you see the decorations, exactly the same. So I'm more or less 100% sure that these pauldrons belonged to our armor. And again, if you see here on this right picture, you see in the surface of the metal, you see 2 round structures, one on the edge on the top and one more or less in the middle. There have been holes for fixing something, but before the armor was decorated, Peffenhauser or his workshop closed this hole. So again, it shows us that he reused older pieces or pieces originally have made for something else. And so that's you can find really on quite a few on the Peffenhouser armor. Not everything has been made new for his customers.
And another piece in the Wallace collection, is a very good one to mention on that point, especially since we would have no way of connecting it with Peffenhauser if not for the Augsburg decoration. This helmet in the Turkish style, or Jishaga, helmet for light cavalrymen. It's in the Ottoman style, but it's very much of a South German workmanship, and also displaying very distinctive Augsburg etched and gilt decoration, which compares very well, though not precisely, to decoration we find on Peffenhauser armors in Dresden.
Exactly. I mean, the Turkish fashion was very important in these days, so it doesn't wonder that they also wanted to have Oriental styled helmets for the armor. And you also had tournaments where one party was dressed like Turks and things. So that really fits very well. The interesting thing is, as you mentioned, is really this decoration, which is not identical, but very similar. But we know, I mean, we have now two more or less identical suits of armor in Dresden with this decoration. But we know that there must have been more. There are paintings where people are wearing suits of armor with exactly this decoration. But you can see it's not the armor, one of these two armor which are still in Dresden. So the interesting thing is really, so this helmet has been used for at least in very similar armor, probably made by Peffenhauser. But the interesting thing is that this helmet originally came from Nuremberg, because you have the city mark of Nuremberg on the helmet. But this mark, normally, is you will find this city mark in an undecorated area of an armor or helmet. But here it's underneath the decoration. So the decoration has been made around the city mark. So the interesting thing is really that probably Peffenhauser bought this helmet in Nuremberg to fix it to one of his suits of armor, and the decoration has been made in Augsburg. That sounds really strange, but it was very common for him, and I found a lot of letters where the Augsburg Armor Guild complained because of this practice of Peffenhauser buying suits of armor or pieces in Nuremberg and selling them together with his armor. But so it became more and more normal in these days, and Peffenhauser was the reason why the Augsburg Armor Guild changed quite a few of the rules just to keep him in Augsburg, and not that he probably is moving to Nuremberg because it was easier for him to work there. But it's really nice that we have, with this fantastic helmet in the Wallace collection, an example where you really can show this practice of buying pieces in Nuremberg and reuse them in Augsburg as part of an Augsburg suit of armor.
But without that documentary research that tells the story, this helmet would remain a puzzle, because it doesn't have Peffenhauser's mark on it, and we wouldn't have any of that backstory. I love this because it's one of these wonderful examples where the objects and the documents are really working together to explain each other.
That's right, yeah.
And it feels like when you have all of the evidence agreeing like that, it feels that we are getting closer to reality. We can feel comfortable that where we're going with the research is what really was happening historically. And we don't always feel like that.
That's right, yeah.
So then, of course, if we're going to talk about Peffenhauser in Dresden, we have to mention, of course, what must be the most famous of all Peffenhauser works.
it is definitely very, very famous simply because quite a few collections in the world have pieces of that. So the story was in 1591, the wife of Christian I ordered a set of 12 similar suits of armor as a Christmas present for her husband. And the problem was that Christian died in September 1591 before the Christmas present was in Dresden. So he never did see them. And from these 12 pieces, 3 have been already given away in 1610 as a gift to one of the Wallenstein family. And the other 9 still remained in Dresden till the late 19th century. And then, unfortunately, they started to give some away. And the latest left Dresden in 1924. So we still have 3 in Dresden now. And the other 6 are yeah, you did write it down. So one is in London, one is in New York, one is in Detroit, one is in St. Petersburg, one is in Nuremberg, and one is in Warsaw. So they are.
I'll put your 3 in there. I don't have a great photograph, but just to get the full family picture, I'm quite pleased to have all of them in one slide. Actually,
yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have a proper picture of the 3 together. We definitely have to do one. At the moment, we have only this photograph from the showcase and single photographs from the 3 single armor. The interesting thing is they really are very similar in the first view, but if you see the decoration, they are all slightly different, and also the sizes are different. So what again gives us the reason to ask what you already asked before, when an order of 12 of these very similar armor has been made, was it all for Christian himself, or was it for some friends of him, where it was clear, okay, at the next foot tournament, Christian and his 11 best friends would fight together as a company?
It must simply. I mean, it must have been. I mean, these combats at the barriers were so lavish and so fashionable in the end of the 16th century, and invariably they were fought in teams of 12 or more per side, and these teams are fighting on foot across a waist-high fence, the barrier. So these armors don't have leg armor for that reason, and the teams fight each other across the barrier with the spear first, and then with the sword. Yeah. And these armors were used. I mean, many of them do have evidence of fighting damage on them, but just not in Christian's lifetime, I suppose.
Not his lifetime. He was dead when they came, but I mean, they definitely have been used in the 17th century and in the early 18th century. So have a lot of cuts at the visors. But the interesting thing for Dresden, again, is that our collection still have been used in the early 20th century. So at the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936, there was a performances of tournaments in Dresden in the stable yard, the original tournament ground of the Electors of Saxony, where they still use these armor for these festivities. And we even have a helmet, unfortunately you can't see it on these pictures, where they drilled holes in the visor, additional holes in 1936, because the person who was wearing this armor couldn't breathe enough. And so they drilled holes in the visor, which is really terrible. But
but then of course there are, this group is so famous that it starts to attract other attributions. I mean, we have these surviving, but there were originally more. We have an armor in the Wallace collection that's worth mentioning in this context too, because although it is now white rather than blued, it does carry very similar decoration. Not the same, mind you, but quite similar. And the upper parts, certainly the breastplate, the helmet, perhaps the right shoulder, these are also for barrier combat, but maybe for a different series that Peffenhouser made for someone else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you see a lot of very big similarities, but it's not really exactly the same. And I mean, of course, if it would be blued, then you could believe, okay, the variation of the decoration of the nine still existing of the armor from 1591 is so big, it could fit into the series. But there are some differences where I think, no, it was definitely not part of the series. But probably, as you said, probably Peffenhouser either he made a single one for a single person, or it was also a group of several very similar armor. I mean, there are, for example, there's a single helmet in the, I think, Higgins collection, I think, which is very similar to your helmet. So it might have been part of a bigger group of very similar food tournament armor as well. Yeah.
And we have to be a little bit careful, of course, with this one in the Wallace, because this is an object that was on the commercial market in the middle of the 19th century. We don't know precisely how it entered our collection, but this is how Sir Richard Wallace and his father collected. And it has some pieces on it that were originally plain, and then a 19th century craftsman has etched the matching pattern copied from the breastplate and the helmet onto the gauntlets and the feet, for example. So this one has complexities of interpretation, but there are also encouraging clues in the fine details. I'm fascinated by the fact that many Peffenhouser armors all over the world, separated by sometimes by decades in their manufacture, all have very similar buckles. I mean, not all buckles on these armors are original, but many of them are, and many of the Peffenhouser works of the Wallace Collection have these very distinctive, beautiful little copper gilt buckles. Do you have similar things in Dresden, presumably?
Yeah, and not only the buckles, it's also the plume holders at the helmets. They are also very similar. And what really fascinates me is that, okay, if you would have the same buckles, the same plume holders in one collection, then it's quite clear that it could be possible that they have been fixed on the armor later in Dresden, in who knows. But if you find the same buckles, the same plume holders on Peffenhouser armor in more or less all the collections, and armor where we exactly know that, for example, your armor in the Wallace collection never have been in Dresden. So that, for me, it's really quite clear that these buckles and also the plume holders must have been original from the workshop of Peffenhouser. And so far, I couldn't find any works of other Augsburg armorer with the same buckles, the same plume holders on it. So it's something really not very, it's not very obvious, but it's something really could help you to find out really what has been made in the workshops of Peffenhouser, what not. And so it's already a huge number of suits of armor with the same buckles or very similar buckles and very similar plume holders, where the difference is really, it's minor differences. So they are more or less identical.
It's a lesson and a reminder that we must always pay attention to the little details.
Exactly.
However apparently inconsequential, the meaning can be there. You also have children's armor by Peffenhouser in Dresden.
Yeah, we have 3 children armor, or originally it has been, there have been 4, because in 1591, together with these foot tournament armor, probably, we don't know here, it's not, we don't have any documents for that, but probably, again, the wife of Christian I ordered these 2 children armor for the oldest sons, for Christian II and also the future Elector Johann Georg I. Unfortunately, only one of these 2 survived. We don't know what happened to the other one. But it's also blued. The decoration is quite similar to this foot tournament armor, except that here you have also armor for the legs, not only for the body and for the arms. Yeah, and then 3 years later, the two sons of Christian I got gifts, one armor each, from the administrator, from Duke Friedrich Wilhelm I of Saxony-Weimar, because when Christian I died in 1591, Christian II was only 8 years old, and so of course he couldn't rule the country himself. And so Friedrich Wilhelm I of Saxony-Weimar became the administrator of Saxony, and he gave these two armor as a gift to these boys. And so Christian II was 11 years old, and his brother was 9 years old. So these armor are slightly bigger than the blued one, but again with a very typical decoration. And the interesting thing is, we have this painting on the left-hand side of Duke Friedrich Wilhelm I of Saxony-Weimar, wearing an armor with more or less identical decoration. And what always, so it's quite possible that he had an armor made by Peffenhauser himself with this decoration, and he ordered these two children's armor for the little princess on purpose with the same decoration as his own armor. But unfortunately, this armor didn't survive, and so we can't be sure.
If that was the case, though, it would have been a really extraordinary kind of visual statement at the Saxon court, that he's almost taking on the role of a surrogate father. Certainly in visual terms, if the boys now have matching armors with this person. It's like a dynastic statement, isn't it?
Yeah, and especially because the family of Friedrich Wilhelm I was from the Ernestine line of the Wettin dynasty, and the electors of Saxony in these days were from the Albertine line. And these two lines were not really very friendly to each other, so they have been enemies from time to time. So it's even more fascinating that, probably he ordered these armor in the same decoration as his own one.
Now, so Holger, so far, it's seemed like the work of Peffenhauser, this very lavishly decorated, technically complicated armor systems, have been fairly easy to recognize or to attribute to Peffenhauser. I mean, most of what we've talked about so far isn't really that controversial, although we can't always be sure of the fine details. But there are other armors, Augsburg armors at Dresden, where we think they might be Peffenhauser, but it's not at all so easy.
Yeah, now you started a really complicated group of suits of armor. There is a group of 4 very similar suits of armor, where the main pieces are in New York, in London, in Coburg, in Nuremberg, and in Dresden. Originally, there was a set of 2 made for Johann Wilhelm I of Saxony-Weimar in the time around 1560, 1570, something like that. And then the other 2 have been made for his son, Friedrich Wilhelm I of Saxe-Weimar in the 1580s, late 1580s, something like that.
And,
the interesting thing,
all of these armors can be recognized with this very distinctive black and gold kind of twisting riband decoration.
Exactly. The decoration is very similar, but still you can see differences. The older group, the decoration is not only this black and golden decoration, but you also it's going deep into the metal, and it's more it's going upwards and downwards with the decoration.
The etch is much deeper into the metal.
not only etched, it's also
embossed and chased.
Embossed, yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the younger two garnitures, you only have the edge decoration and the gilded decoration. You don't have this embossed deepness of the decoration. The interesting thing really is that you only find on the of the younger two armor, you can find the city mark of Augsburg on it. The older two pieces are not marked at all. You can't find anything, no city mark, no armourer's mark, nothing on it. And traditionally, they always have been related to or attributed to Anton Peffenhauser. And actually, really, the two younger armor from Friedrich Wilhelm I, they have really quite a few characteristic elements which really are the same as with these Peffenhauser armor, where we know that they have been made by Peffenhauser. But still, we don't really can say whether it is Peffenhauser or not, and whether these two older suits of armor have been made by the same person as the two younger suits of armor, or actually perhaps Friedrich Wilhelm just said, I would like to have two suits of armor in a very similar decoration, and then okay, he ordered his armor, and the etcher made the same decoration, very similar decoration, because he could look very closely at the older armor. But it's still quite tricky to find out the really background, the truth of the history of these suits of armor, especially because also all these pieces have been mixed up a lot. So the pieces in New York and Dresden, you have two suits of armor, one for tilting, one for the foot tournament and for the field, but the elements are mixed, and the same with the armor in Coburg and Nuremberg, where also, for example, the pauldrons are mixed. So you have the left pauldron of the one is and the right pauldron of the other are together on one armor. So it's really tricky with these old collections where they use these armor again and again, and sometimes they really mix them up completely. It's the same with these tournament armor from 1591, the blued one. They also are mixed completely.
And it's true for the majority of the Peffenhauser armors at the Wallace Collection as well. We have, apart from that decorated one, we have 6 more. 3 apparently for jousting and 3 configured for the mounted tourney. But really, when you look closely at these, they have pieces for all forms of joust and tournament kind of mixed all together. Again, a product probably of compositions made in the 19th century for commercial gain, really. But I love the Wallace series because they're a wonderful complement to everything we've seen so far. I mean, the etched and gilt decoration is fabulous, but as you already said, Holger, there's a lot of evidence for Peffenhauser making so-called white armors or just plain polished armors with no decoration at all.
Exactly, yeah. And I really love this group. It's so elegant in shape, so brilliant made steel work where the decoration doesn't hit anything, and actually some of them are even marked with the Peffenhauser armours mark, which also is very important because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we only have very few armor made by Peffenhauser with his own mark on it. And what also is interesting here, perhaps you can show us the picture with the filled holes on it on one of the press.
Yeah, this breastplate, not only does it have, it's obviously recycled, it's also got the marks of Wolfgang Großschädel and also the Eisenhut mark, the city mark of Landshut. So normally we would assume that this breastplate was mixed in with some Peffenhauser pieces in the 19th century. But your research has shown that Peffenhauser himself was doing such things. And
Yeah.
we have the filled holes on the breastplate, converting a jousting breastplate for another purpose. And we know that Peffenhouser did things like this.
Yeah, I mean, you can find exactly this type of filled holes on quite a few of our armor in Dresden, and so it's exactly the same way how they did it. So yeah, I still think it's that it was not made later somewhere in the history of the suits of armor. It probably has been made in the workshop of Peffenhauser to reuse these pieces. And I mean, here in this case, it's even more tricky if you have the mark of a different armor on the breast and the city mark of Landshut on a very prominent part of the chest of the breast where you can see it. But still, I mean, you have seen it on your helmet. It didn't made corrected this area. They didn't scratch the mark away. They kept it, and they perhaps they even have been proud for the work of different people and that they could involve this. I mean, in the case of the helmet, I mean, these Oriental style helmets, Nürnberg was famous for these helmets. And of course, Peffenhauser could have made something like that, but it was probably more important to show, okay, I have one of the best products in this style from Nürnberg, and I use it for my armor. And here, Großschädel, I mean, it was a very famous family of armor. And so why scratching this mark away if I can show you, oh, it's good quality pressed.
But both of those examples, and this one especially, they again are wonderful examples of how an object can give color to the story of this person. That it demonstrates potentially his incredible, creativity as a businessman. He takes these huge contracts to make a whole series of tournament armors on short notice for the Bavarian court or whatever, and then he has clever, creative, diverse ways of filling that contract.
Yep.
And the objects show that, and the documents show that.
Yep,
so we should wrap up and give ourselves a little time for questions if we still have it. But just to finish on the man himself and his spectacularly successful life in other ways. Not only did he have a working lifetime of 50 or more years, he also had 2 wives and 14 children, all depicted on this funerary plate. Not all of those children, of course, survived, and the second wife was a result of the death of the first wife. Nevertheless, quite an extraordinary man in many ways. I think you'll agree. Holger, do you have any plans to publish the work or any thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are 2 plans for 2 different publications. The one thing, the minor version would be just to publicate the Dresden armor, and not only the suits of armor which are still in Dresden, but also the pieces which originally have been in Dresden and are now in different collections. That's one project, but another project in cooperation with people from different collections, and hopefully also from the Wallace Collection with you, Toby, would be a publication about the whole oeuvre of Peffenhauser, where we also can discuss the connection of the armor in different collections together, and also different problems where you only can find solutions if you can put things from different collections together. So that would be a bigger publication, probably in English. The other one would be probably more in German, I think. So we will see how, if we have the money to do that, if enough people are ready to work together at this project. So it would be great to have both of these publications, or we will see.
I really, really look forward to it. I'll invite Ollie back now and just thank everyone for taking the time to come along today. Ollie, do you think we've got time for a few questions? I know we're a little bit over, but
certainly, yes. Well, first of all, just to say, of course, thank you, Toby and Holger, for today's talk. It's been a real pleasure to sit in myself, as always. Fantastic to hear about the armours in both our collection and elsewhere. I think we'll have to plan a trip to Dresden soon to take a closer look at some of these fantastic works of art. As I said, we have run over a bit. We do have a few questions that have come through already. So first of all, on Zoom, we've had a question from an anonymous attendee. They've asked how much input would armourers like Peffenhauser have on the decorative etched motifs on their armour, given they're working with other artists? Big question style.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely know that the customers did have the chance to have ideas and to give them to armourers or to people who did the decoration. So we know, for example, that that Peffenhouser did send a sample to Elector August of Saxony to ask whether this kind of decoration is all right for him. But of course, in this case, Peffenhouser was just a middleman. So he gave the decoration from the etcher to the elector. The elector could choose, I like it or I don't like it. And then he gave it back to the other person. I really don't know whether the armourer had any influences. But I mean, at least, of course, we know that some of the decoration was typical for Augsburg in these days. So yeah, it's difficult.
And I mean, I found it certainly a bit earlier rather than the later 16th century, but certainly in the first half of the 16th century in Augsburg in particular, there are armors where the hammer work of the plates agrees and works together with the etching and gilding so well in such a complex way, where etched design is not just on the surface, but it's enhanced with embossing and chasing, you know, decoration in relief that's then augmented with the etching. You just have to think that the armorer and the etcher sat down together and talked it over. There's sort of no other way for that kind of thing to work. We don't see so much of that on Peffenhauser's work, but it is there. There you do have embossed decoration enhancing the etching on pauldrons and things like that, don't you, Holger?
Yeah, you definitely on the especially on the back of the pauldrons you have quite often you have embossed decoration, but also on other pieces. Yes, of course they work together very well and very close, but I'm still not sure whether it was either this kind of decoration was typical for the time in Augsburg or whether the customers did have been involved very deeply. But yeah, as you said, they had to work together quite closely, and that's for sure.
Certainly, that's a fantastic image of the idea of an armourer like Peffenhauser and an etcher like Zorg sitting down and kind of work it out together. Thank you very much. I've got time perhaps for just one more question to squeeze in, and this is quite a broad question again, and I think we've touched on this a little already with regards to publications and books. We've had a question over YouTube. They've asked a question for both Toby and Holger. What is, in your opinion, a must-read for armour enthusiasts in German or in English? Big question for you to end.
Yeah, I definitely think the books of Toby about the English armour. That's for sure. And I mean, yeah, there have been quite a few really nice publications in the last few years. I mean, Pierre Terjean from New York did publish quite a few interesting things in the last few years. Yeah.
It's often the case in Arms and Armour that some of the really key research has historically been published in exhibition catalogs. And there are a number of exhibitions whose publications are kind of part of the bedrock of the subject. The Negroli exhibition at the Met in the 1990s, for example, or Pierre Terjanian's exhibition on Maximilian only a couple of years ago, also at the Met. Those are important opportunities to execute and publish new research. There's also other basic books, like in 1958, Claude Blair wrote what remains one of the seminal textbooks on European armor, entitled, helpfully enough, European Armor. Claude, before he passed away in 2010, asked me to write an updated version of that book, which I've been working on periodically and hope to complete in the next couple of years. So hopefully that work will be reissued in a slightly different, updated format in the not too distant future. But I think generally it's quite a good time for publications in arms and armor. The museums are doing a lot of interesting things. There's a lot more resources online too. I mean, just in the last 3 or 4 years, the number of online resources, catalog resources that museums have published is really, really extraordinary. So it's a good time for our subject, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Fantastic. Well, I think, as we said, we have run over a little bit. So thank you to both Toby and to Holger again for today's talk. And of course, thank you to everybody for joining us, whether that's on YouTube or on Zoom and wherever that is in the world. I've seen comments from the United States of America. We have people joining us from the Netherlands and so on and so forth. It's fantastic to have a really international audience for these talks. We hope you can join us, not in August, we'll be taking a short break, but in September when we return with our Meet the Experts series, and our curator Suzanne Higgett here at the Wallace Collection will be taking a closer look at 150 years of the Wallace fountain. So we do hope you can join us in September, on September 15th for that talk. And in the meantime, do please take a look at Toby's most recent expert choice film if you just can't get enough of information about Anton Peffenhauser. So thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, bye.